Clara was a simple woman who lived in a quiet little town where everyone knew each other's names. Her life was ordinary but peaceful. She lived in a small house at the edge of town, surrounded by wildflowers and the sound of chirping birds every morning. She worked at a local diner, serving coffee, pancakes, and warm smiles to everyone who came in. People liked her because she was kind, polite, and never complained, no matter how long her shifts were. But behind her gentle smile, Clara carried a past that no one really knew. She never talked much about herself. When people asked about her family or hobbies, she would just laugh softly and change the topic. To most people, she was just a hardworking woman who minded her own business. They thought she had always been this way, calm, quiet, and simple. Every day after work, Clara walked home, carrying a small paper bag of groceries. She would stop by the town park to feed the birds or sit on the old wooden bench to watch the sunset. Her life moved slowly like a peaceful song without any surprises. She didn't have fancy clothes, big dreams, or many friends, but she had a heart full of kindness and a soul that loved peace. Sometimes, when she passed by the old music shop near the diner, she would stop for a moment to look through the dusty window. Inside there were violins, guitars, and a few pianos that nobody bought anymore. Her eyes always stayed a little longer on the pianos, especially the grand one in the corner. It reminded her of something, a memory she had buried deep inside. But she would quickly look away and continue walking home, pretending she had just been curious. The truth was, years ago, Clara had been a gifted pianist. She had started playing when she was a little girl, sitting beside her father who taught her how to love music. Music had been her world. It made her feel alive, free, and full of dreams. But life had not been kind. Her father passed away when she was young, and her family couldn't afford piano lessons anymore. Slowly, music faded from her life like a forgotten song. She grew up, took a job to survive, and let go of the dreams she once had. No one in town knew any of this. To them, Clara was just the sweet woman who made the best apple pie at the diner and always remembered everyone's usual order. She wasn't someone who stood out, not the type people expected to have a secret talent or a hidden story. Yet, sometimes at night when the streets were quiet and the only sound was the soft hum of crickets, Clara would sit by her small window and hum tunes from her childhood. She would imagine her fingers dancing over piano keys again, just like they used to. Those moments made her feel both happy and sad. Happy to remember the joy of music, and sad because it was no longer part of her life. The people who knew her thought she was content. They never guessed that inside her calm heart lived a storm of unspoken dreams. Clara had accepted her simple life, but somewhere deep down, a small spark still glowed, the love for music that never truly died. Every morning, she went to work early, opened the diner, and prepared breakfast for the townsfolk. The mayor came for his black coffee, the school teacher ordered her toast and tea, and the children from the nearby school would wave to her on their way to class. Everyone liked her, but no one really knew her, and that was fine with Clara. She didn't seek attention or fame. She found beauty in the ordinary, the smell of fresh coffee, the laughter of children, the orange sky at sunset. Her life might have seemed small to others, but to her it was peaceful and safe. She had learned to live quietly, keeping her music locked in her heart. But fate has a funny way of reminding people of who they truly are. Sometimes the universe waits for the perfect moment to open an old door and let the past come rushing in. Clara had no idea that one simple evening at the town's community hall would change her life forever. She didn't know that a harmless prank would awaken the part of her that she thought was gone forever. The pianist, the dreamer, the woman with magic in her fingertips. For now, she was just Clara, the kind woman who worked hard, smiled often, and lived a life no one found special. But life was preparing something extraordinary for her, something that would soon show the world that even the simplest souls can carry the most beautiful music inside them. Little did anyone know, beneath her quiet presence lived a melody waiting to be heard again, a melody that would soon touch every heart in the room. A few weeks later, the small town where Clara lived began to buzz with excitement. The annual Community Talent Night was coming up, a cheerful event held every year at the old town hall. It wasn't anything grand, but for the townspeople it was something special. Children practiced dances, teenagers rehearsed songs, and older folks planned funny skits. Everyone looked forward to it. Not for fame or competition, but for laughter, joy, and togetherness. The town hall was an old brick building that smelled of polished wood and memories. Every year, It was decorated with colorful lights and paper stars made by local schoolchildren. That evening, people started to gather early. Families came holding homemade pies, friends brought folding chairs, and laughter filled the cool evening air. Clara finished her shift at the diner just in time. Her manager, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Harper, said with a grin, "Go on, Clara. You work too hard. You deserve some fun tonight." Clara smiled shyly, wiped her hands on her apron, and decided to go. She didn't plan to perform, she just wanted to sit quietly, enjoy the show, and clap for others. As she walked toward the town hall, she could already hear the chatter and the faint sound of someone tuning a guitar. The sky was painted orange and pink, and the lights around the building twinkled like tiny stars. Clara loved moments like this, simple, warm, and full of life. Inside, the crowd was lively. Children were giggling near the stage curtain. Young people were taking selfies, and older couples found seats near the front. The host, a friendly man named Tom, was testing the microphone.
"Good evening, everyone,"
he boomed, his voice echoing across the room. "Welcome to our annual talent night. Tonight we'll laugh, we'll sing, and who knows, maybe we'll discover a star." Clara chuckled softly and found a seat near the back. She greeted a few familiar faces, people she served at the diner every morning. Everyone knew Clara, but no one paid her much attention beyond small talk and polite smiles. She liked it that way. The show began with a group of kids dancing to a pop song. The audience clapped and cheered. Then a young boy recited a poem about friendship, and a few teenagers performed a comedy sketch that had everyone laughing. The air was full of joy, music, and community spirit. During the break, people mingled and shared snacks. Someone played light music in the background. An old, slightly out-of-tune piano sat in the corner, its paint chipped and keys yellowed with age. It had been in the hall for decades, mostly used as decoration. Nobody really played it anymore. Then a group of friends, playful, slightly mischievous, noticed it. "Hey," one of them said with a grin, "what if someone played that thing tonight? It'd be hilarious." They all laughed. "Who could we get to do it?" another asked. Their eyes wandered across the room until they spotted Clara sitting quietly with her cup of tea. She looked gentle, harmless, and the perfect target for a harmless prank. "Let's ask Clara," one of them whispered. "She's so sweet, she'll probably say yes." They didn't mean any harm. It was just supposed to be a funny moment. An ordinary woman pressing random keys on an old broken piano. Everyone would laugh, then move on to the next act. Clara didn't notice them at first. She was busy watching a little girl sing a soft lullaby. But soon one of the young men approached her. "Hey, Miss Clara," he said cheerfully. "Would you play something on the piano for us?" "Just for fun." Clara blinked, surprised. "Me? Oh no, I don't play," she said, waving her hands. "Come on, it's just for laughs. That old piano's barely alive anyway," another teased. "We just need someone brave enough to touch it." People nearby chuckled. The idea spread quickly, and soon others started joining in, encouraging her. "Yes, Clara, go for it," someone shouted playfully. "Let's see what kind of music we get from that poor piano." Clara's cheeks turned pink. She smiled nervously. "Oh, I really don't know if I should," she murmured. But deep down something stirred. A tiny voice buried for years, whispering, "Try." The piano sat there, silent, waiting. The crowd clapped and cheered lightly, egging her on. Clara hesitated again, then finally nodded. "All right," she said softly. "But don't laugh too hard if it sounds terrible." The room erupted in light laughter and applause. The pranksters exchanged amused glances, thinking this would be just another funny moment to end the evening. As Clara walked slowly to the stage, the wooden floor creaked beneath her shoes. The host handed her a small stool, smiling kindly. "You've got this, Clara," he said. She looked at the piano, old, cracked, with several broken keys. Her reflection in its glossy lid looked back at her, nervous yet curious. It had been years since her hands touched real keys. Years since she'd felt that familiar flutter in her chest. The crowd fell quiet. The prank had turned into a moment of unexpected anticipation. Even the ones who planned it suddenly felt a strange curiosity. Who was this simple woman, really? Clara took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered above the dusty keys. For a second, she closed her eyes. Memories of her childhood, her father's warm smile, the sound of their small piano at home, rushed back like a wave. Then, gently, She pressed the first note, and in that instant, everything changed. The soft note that Clara played hung in the air like a whisper from the past. The crowd stayed silent for a heartbeat, unsure whether to laugh or listen. The piano gave a tired creak, its strings slightly off-key, yet there was something gentle about the sound. Clara smiled nervously, her fingers trembling above the dusty keys. The young men who had started the prank stood near the back, trying to hold back their laughter. One of them whispered, "Let's see how long she lasts." They expected a few random notes and awkward silence, something to chuckle about later. But what happened next was nothing they could have imagined. Clara's fingers moved again, this time slower, more sure. She pressed another key, then another. A small melody began to form, uneven but familiar, like a lullaby that had been asleep for years and had just woken up. Her face changed too. The nervous smile faded, replaced by calm focus. For the first time in many years, she felt her heart beating to a rhythm that wasn't made of routine and work. It was made of music. Her old instincts began to return. Every note, every pause, every chord carried a piece of her soul. The crowd, which had started out giggling and whispering, slowly fell silent. The air grew still. Even the children who had been restless in their seats stopped moving. Something about the way Clara touched the piano made the broken instrument sound alive again. But before this transformation truly began, just moments earlier, everything had seemed like an innocent prank. When the idea first came up, no one had expected it to go this far. The piano was almost forgotten. One leg slightly shorter than the others, a few keys missing, and a faint crack along its side. It had been used more for decoration than performance. The townspeople sometimes joked that it would fall apart if anyone dared to play it too long. So when Clara agreed to try, the atmosphere was full of amusement. People whispered and chuckled. "This should be good," someone said. "Let's see what kind of noise that thing makes." Tom, the host, introduced her playfully. "Next we have our brave volunteer, Miss Clara from the diner. Let's see if she can wake this sleepy old piano." Laughter rippled through the hall. It was all in good fun, no one meant to be cruel. But as Clara sat down and placed her fingers on the keys, something shifted. Maybe it was the way she looked at the piano, not with fear or awkwardness, but with quiet affection, like greeting an old friend. The pranksters didn't notice it right away. They were still smiling, waiting for a funny mistake. One of them whispered, "She's gonna break a key for sure." But another, watching her face, frowned slightly. There was something strange. The look in her eyes wasn't nervous anymore. It was peaceful. Clara didn't rush. She took her time, pressing a few keys to test the sound. Each note echoed differently, some sharp, some dull. Yet she seemed to know how to make them work together. Her hands began to move faster, shaping a tune that started small but grew stronger with each passing second. Inside her, old memories unfolded, her father's gentle voice saying, "Feel the music. Clara, don't just play it." She remembered the dusty room where they practiced for hours, her small fingers learning to find beauty in broken chords. Now, sitting in front of that broken piano, she felt it again, that same connection, that same spark. The laughter in the room faded. The pranksters shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. They hadn't expected this. There was no joke anymore. There was only the sound of music, soft yet full of emotion, weaving its way into everyone's hearts. For Clara, the world around her disappeared. The lights, the people, the whispers, and they all blurred away. All that existed was the piano and the memory of what music used to mean to her. Every note she played carried years of silence, struggle, and longing. Her fingers danced like they remembered every song she had ever played, every emotion she had ever buried. The broken piano responded as if it too had been waiting for this moment, to be heard, to be loved again. Someone in the audience whispered, "She's amazing." A woman in the front row clasped her hands together, eyes glistening. Even the host, Tom, stood frozen with the microphone still in his hand, forgetting his next line. Meanwhile, the pranksters who had started it all stood in disbelief. The joke they had planned had turned into something magical, something that made their cheeks burn with guilt. They looked down, realizing how small and foolish their laughter had been. Clara continued to play, lost in the music. She didn't know what the others were feeling. She didn't even remember why she was there. All she knew was that for the first time in years she felt free, like the girl she once was sitting beside her father, learning how to turn pain into melody. The sound filled every corner of the hall. The broken keys didn't matter anymore. They became part of the beauty, a reminder that even imperfect things can create something extraordinary. When she finally lifted her fingers and let the last note fade, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The prank that had started with laughter ended in awe. No one clapped at first, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. They were too stunned. It felt wrong to break the silence after something so pure, and in that silence Clara looked up, her eyes glimmering with tears. For a moment she looked unsure. Had she done something wrong? But then slowly the crowd rose to their feet. The hall erupted with applause. What began as a simple prank had just awakened the forgotten soul of a woman and reminded everyone that real beauty often hides behind the quietest faces. Clara sat still, her hands resting gently on the piano keys. The echoes of her last note faded into a deep, almost sacred silence. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in years: aliveness. The crowd was frozen, half in shock, half in wonder. For a long moment nobody moved. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. Clara looked up nervously, her lips parting as if to apologize. Old habits made her doubt herself instantly. Maybe I played too long. Maybe they didn't like it. Her cheeks warmed with shyness. But then, from the middle of the hall, a small sound broke the silence. Clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with applause. It wasn't polite or forced, it was real, raw, and full of emotion. People stood up, cheering and whistling. The laughter that had started the prank was gone, replaced by admiration and disbelief. Clara blinked rapidly, her eyes shining. She didn't know whether to smile or cry. But just before this beautiful moment, there had been a flicker of hesitation. A small, trembling space between laughter and courage, between the prank and the miracle that followed. When they had first asked her to play, Clara's heart had skipped a beat. The words "play the piano just for fun" had echoed in her head like a bell. She hadn't touched a piano in over 15 years. The thought of it scared her, not because she'd forgotten, but because she remembered too well what it felt like to love something she could no longer have. At first, she had tried to refuse. She had shaken her head, laughing softly. "Oh no, I can't play anymore," she'd said. "It's been too long." But the crowd had cheered, teasing her in a friendly way. "Come on, Clara. Just one note," someone had shouted. "Don't be shy," another had added. Their words were playful, but inside her heart, they stirred something deep. She looked at the piano. It looked old and fragile, like her dreams, covered in scratches, a little broken, yet still standing. She could almost hear it calling her. For a moment she wanted to say no again, to hide behind her gentle smile and stay invisible. It was safer that way. But then, somewhere inside her, a small spark whispered, "What if I still can?" Her fingers tingled at the thought. The crowd around her blurred. She didn't see the faces or hear the teasing anymore. All she heard was that faint inner melody, the one that had lived quietly inside her for years. So she stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. Every step felt like walking back in time, back to the little girl who used to play in her father's living room, dreaming of concert halls and applause. She hesitated for just a moment before sitting down. Her hands hovered over the keys. When her fingers touched them, she froze. The first key she pressed made a dull, broken sound. A wave of embarrassment washed over her. People chuckled softly. She looked up, forcing a smile, trying not to blush. For a second, she thought about walking away. This was a mistake, she told herself. They'll laugh. The piano's broken. I'm rusty. But then she remembered something her father once said. Even broken keys can play a beautiful song if the heart behind them is strong enough. She closed her eyes. That memory, warm, distant and full of love, and gave her courage. She took a deep breath and tried again. This time she didn't think about the people, the prank, or the laughter. She just thought about the music. And when she began to play, it wasn't just sound, it was emotion. Every hesitation melted away, every fear turned into rhythm. The piano responded to her like an old friend who had missed her terribly. The broken notes didn't matter. Somehow they became part of the beauty. As she played, something inside her healed. Each note carried pieces of her life, the pain of losing her father, the years of silence, the quiet strength she found in everyday struggles. Her music told her story in a language words could never speak. The audience could feel it too. They didn't know her history, but they felt the truth in every sound. The pranksters who had started it all now stood frozen, guilt painted across their faces. What they thought would be funny turned into something unforgettable, a moment they would never live down, but would always remember. When Clara finally stopped playing, her hands stayed on the keys for a moment longer. She looked down at them, amazed. The fear that once held her heart captive was gone. In its place was peace, the kind of peace that comes from doing what you were born to do. Then came the applause, the standing ovation, the tears, the smiles. People rushed to the stage to thank her, to hug her, to tell her how beautiful it was. Clara laughed softly through her tears. "It's just an old song," she said modestly, but everyone knew it was much more than that. For Clara, that night was not about showing off talent. It was about rediscovering herself, the part of her that life had tried to silence, and as the applause echoed in her ears, she realized something powerful. Sometimes, life pushes us into uncomfortable moments, not to embarrass us, but to wake up the greatness we forgot we had. The moment Clara's fingers touched the keys, something magical stirred in the air. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling, a whisper of emotion that wrapped around everyone in the room. The first note rang out, soft and trembling, like a fragile bird learning to fly again after years in a cage. It wasn't perfect. The piano was old, the sound uneven, but somehow that imperfection made it even more beautiful. The crowd leaned forward without realizing it. The children who had been giggling earlier went quiet. Even the light seemed to soften, glowing warmly around Clara as she sat there, her head slightly bowed, eyes closed, lost in her own world. At first her fingers moved carefully, testing each key like they were old friends she hadn't seen in years. The sound was slow and gentle, hesitant, like the start of a conversation with someone you once loved but had forgotten how to talk to. Each note carried a story. Every pause held a memory. And then something changed. Her hands began to move with confidence. The melody that flowed out of the piano wasn't from a sheet of music. It came straight from her heart. It was full of longing, warmth, and a quiet sadness that made the listeners feel something deep, something they couldn't quite explain. The pranksters, who had been standing at the back, stopped whispering. Their smiles faded as they exchanged stunned glances. One of them, the boy who first suggested the joke, swallowed hard. "What's happening?" he whispered. "She's incredible," no one answered. No one could. It was as if Clara had opened a secret door, and through that door poured years of hidden emotions. Love, pain, hope, and memories she had never spoken aloud. The broken piano keys responded to her touch as though they remembered her. The cracks and missing pieces didn't matter anymore. In her hands, even the silence between the notes became part of the song. The audience watched her in complete stillness. It was no longer just a small-town talent night. It felt like a sacred moment, something they knew they would never forget. Clara's eyes glistened with tears, but her face was calm. As she played, flashes of her past drifted through her mind. Her father sitting beside her as a child, gently guiding her fingers. The sound of applause from her school recitals. The day she promised herself she'd never touch a piano again because life had taken her dreams away. And now, here she was, playing again, not on a grand stage, not for fame, but because something deep inside her had been awakened by a simple dare. The music rose softly, then swelled with power. It was a song that didn't need words. It spoke directly to the soul. Every person in that hall felt it differently. One remembered lost love, another thought of their late parents. Someone else felt courage blooming in their chest. The piano was no longer broken. It sang. Even the old wooden floor seemed to vibrate with each note. A few people had tears streaming down their faces. A mother hugged her child tightly without knowing why. The world outside the hall didn't exist anymore. There was only this room, this music, and the woman who had once believed her best days were behind her. And then, in the middle of the song, something breathtaking happened. The piano hit one of its broken keys, a harsh, discordant sound. For a second, Clara froze. The sound echoed sharply and a few people gasped. She could have stopped there. She could have panicked, apologized, and walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled. A small, knowing smile. Then she pressed that same broken key again, softly this time, weaving it into the rhythm. Somehow that imperfect sound became part of the melody, a reminder that beauty doesn't come from perfection, but from the heart behind it. The audience was mesmerized. Note after note, the music grew stronger, brighter. Clara's hands moved faster now, flowing like water over the keys. Her posture straightened, her expression peaceful and radiant. The fear that once held her was gone and replaced by pure joy. The young man who had teased her earlier wiped his eyes. It was supposed to be a joke, he whispered to his friend, but she's playing like she was born to do this. His friend nodded silently, unable to look away. The melody reached its peak, a powerful, emotional wave that filled the hall and seemed to touch the stars outside. Then slowly, softly it began to fade, like a sunset disappearing beyond the hills. The last note lingered in the air for a long, trembling moment. Then there was silence. Not awkward silence, but sacred silence. The kind that comes after something holy, something real. Clara kept her hands on the piano for a few seconds more, breathing slowly. Her eyes opened and she looked around the room. Every face was turned toward her, wide-eyed, speechless, changed. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know how long she had been playing. She only knew that her heart felt lighter than it had in years. And in that silence, before anyone clapped or spoke, a soft tear slipped down her cheek. She whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for letting me remember." Then the crowd erupted in applause. It was loud, genuine, endless applause. The sound filled the hall like thunder and warmth. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, smiling. And as Clara looked around, her shy smile returned. The smile of a simple woman who never expected to shock the world, yet somehow had. The prank was forgotten. The laughter was gone. Only the music remained. For a long while, the applause wouldn't stop. It filled every corner of the hall like waves crashing on a quiet shore. But inside Clara's heart, something even louder was happening, something wordless, bright, and new. As she sat there still in front of the piano, she felt as if time had slowed. Her fingers, resting gently on the keys, tingled as though they had just woken from a long, deep sleep. The crowd in front of her blurred. She could barely see the faces. All she could feel was the music still vibrating inside her chest. Clara had changed. Moments ago, she was just a simple woman, quiet, humble, invisible to most. Now, without even trying, she had become something more, a living reminder of what passion, once lost, can do when it finds its way back home. The pranksters who had started it all stood near the wall, unable to move. Guilt and awe mixed in their eyes. They hadn't meant to be cruel, they only wanted to laugh. But now they wished they could take it back. Not because they were ashamed, but because what they witnessed had turned their hearts inside out. One of them, the youngest, whispered softly, "I thought she'd be funny. I didn't know she'd be beautiful." His words trembled with honesty. Clara turned slightly toward the crowd and smiled, a soft, shy smile that made her eyes glimmer. "I haven't played in a very long time," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't even know if I still could." The hall was silent again, listening. She glanced down at the piano, her fingers brushing its surface lovingly. "This old piano," she continued, "is broken, but sometimes broken things have their own kind of music." Her words touched something deep in everyone's heart. It wasn't just about the piano anymore, it was about life, about people, about how pain, loss, and hardship could still make something beautiful if faced with love. A woman in the front row began to cry softly. An old man removed his hat and nodded, eyes shining. Even the children seemed to understand something, that what they had just seen wasn't a performance, but a piece of someone's soul. And in that moment, the transformation wasn't only in Clara, it was in everyone. Something invisible passed through the crowd, a warmth, a reflection. They saw themselves in her, the mother who gave up her dreams to raise her children, the man who once painted but stopped after life became too busy, the teenager who loved to sing but lost confidence. Clara had reminded them all that it was never truly too late. Tom, the host, stepped forward slowly, wiping the corner of his eye. "Clara," he said, his voice shaking, "you didn't just play a song tonight. You gave us something we didn't even know we needed." The audience agreed with loud cheers and another round of applause. Clara laughed softly, embarrassed but glowing from within. She didn't see herself the way they did. She wasn't trying to be inspiring or impressive. She had simply followed her heart, and that had been enough to touch everyone else's. As she stood up, she noticed her hands trembling. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was energy. Pure, joyful energy that made her feel alive again. The years of silence, the loneliness, the forgotten dream, they no longer felt heavy. They felt like stepping stones that led her back to this exact moment. Her eyes wandered across the crowd. She saw the faces of the pranksters, young, guilty, but deeply moved. She smiled at them gently, and one of them looked down, ashamed. "Don't be sorry," she said kindly, as if she could read their thoughts. "If you hadn't asked me to play, I wouldn't have remembered what it felt like to be me again." Her forgiveness was like light breaking through clouds. The boys nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. One of them whispered, "Thank you," and meant it. The piano sat silently behind her now, but it seemed to glow in the soft light, as if proud to have been part of something magical. The cracks and worn keys no longer looked ugly. They looked like scars that told a story. Someone in the audience called out, "Play one more." Clara hesitated, smiling. "I don't know if my heart can handle another song tonight," she said with a laugh. The crowd chuckled warmly. She placed one hand over her heart. "But maybe next time." And as she stepped down from the stage, people reached out to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how she had made them feel. A little girl handed her a daisy from her hair and said, "That was the prettiest thing I ever heard." Clara's eyes filled with tears again as she hugged the child gently. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. Clara stepped into the breeze, the sound of distant laughter and clapping still echoing behind her. She looked up at the sky, full of stars, and took a deep breath. The air felt different now, fresher, freer. She realized something beautiful. The prank hadn't humiliated her. It had healed her. She walked home slowly, her shoes tapping softly on the cobblestone path, and as she passed by the music shop, she paused. In the window sat a small upright piano, a little dusty but shining faintly under the streetlight. For the first time in years, she didn't just look. She smiled inside her. Something had shifted forever. The woman who once saw herself as ordinary had become extraordinary, not because she wanted to, but because life gave her a chance to show who she really was. And as the moonlight touched her face, Clara whispered to herself, almost like a promise, "I'll play again." The town hall was still buzzing with excitement long after Clara left the stage. People gathered in small groups, talking in hushed, astonished voices. Some were smiling, others wiping away the last traces of tears. Nobody could stop thinking about what had just happened. Who was she, with this quiet woman who played like an angel? Most people in town had known Clara for years, yet no one had really known her. To them, she was the polite lady from the diner, always early, always cheerful, never seeking attention. But now, the image of her sitting at that broken piano had burned itself into everyone's mind. The woman they once overlooked had become the heart of the evening. Then someone spoke, an older woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who had been sitting in the front row. Her voice trembled as she said, "I think I know who she is." The crowd turned to her instantly. "What do you mean?" someone asked. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes were wide with emotion. Years ago, before she moved here, she was Clara Dalton, the pianist. She used to play in recitals and small concerts. My sister saw her once in the city. She said Clara played with so much emotion that even the conductor cried. A gasp rippled through the room. Clara Dalton, that name rang in the minds of a few who remembered faintly hearing about her years ago. A young pianist who had shown great promise, then disappeared from the music world without a trace. She had a scholarship, Mrs. Fletcher continued softly, a bright future. Then her father passed away suddenly and she left everything. No one heard from her again. The crowd grew quiet. It all began to make sense now. The way Clara had hesitated before sitting at the piano, the way her fingers trembled before finding confidence, and how every note she played seemed to carry a lifetime of emotion. What had started as a prank had unearthed something sacred, a story of loss, love, and rediscovery. Meanwhile, outside the hall, Clara walked home under the silver moonlight. Her hand still tingled with the memory of the keys. She felt strange and not tired, not sad, just full, as if a piece of her heart that had been missing for years had finally returned. When she reached her little house, she sat by the window and stared out at the night sky. The air smelled of rain and earth, and for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Inside her, memories began to stir, old, painful ones she had locked away. She remembered her father, sitting beside her on a wooden stool, teaching her scales when she was only 6. She remembered the way his rough hands guided hers across the ivory keys, his voice gentle and proud. "Music is not about perfection, Clara," he used to say. "It's about truth. Play it with your heart, not just your hands." She had lived by those words, and she had loved music deeply, so deeply that losing it had felt like losing herself. After her father's death, life had fallen apart quickly. The piano was sold to pay debts, the scholarship slipped away, and Clara had to work to survive. Each year she told herself she would return to music someday. But someday kept moving further away until it vanished completely. Now, years later, fate had brought her back to a piano, not in a concert hall, but in a small town, as part of a silly joke. Yet somehow that prank had turned into the very moment her soul had been waiting for. Inside the hall, people were still talking about her. They didn't know she had already gone home, sitting quietly with tears glistening in her eyes, smiling at the thought of her father's voice echoing in her heart. "You did well, my girl," she could almost hear him say. "You finally played again." The next morning, the whole town was alive with whispers. At the diner, people filled the tables earlier than usual, hoping to see her. When Clara walked in, wearing her usual plain apron and soft smile, the entire room fell silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and another. Soon the whole diner was applauding her again. Clara blushed deeply. "Oh, please stop," she said, half laughing. "I only played for fun." But a man near the counter said softly, "You didn't just play, Miss Clara. You made us feel." She looked at him, then at all the smiling faces around her, and her eyes filled with tears again. She had never expected this kind of kindness, this kind of recognition. Word spread quickly beyond the town. A local journalist wrote a small article titled, "A Simple Woman, a Broken Piano, and the Night Music Came Alive." Within days, it was shared across social media, touching hearts everywhere. People who had never heard her name were now moved by her story. A story about rediscovering lost dreams, about beauty and brokenness. Clara didn't seek fame or attention. She continued her simple life at the diner, but something inside her had changed forever. Every time she walked past the music shop window, she no longer turned away. Sometimes after closing hours, she would hum softly to herself, her fingers tapping invisible keys on the counter. The music had returned, not to the stage but to her heart, where it had always belonged, and in that quiet little town, everyone now looked at her differently, not just as Clara from the diner but as Clara Dalton, the woman who reminded them that miracles often come disguised as mistakes, and that sometimes even a prank can become the beginning of a legend. The sun had barely set when the town hall filled again the next evening. Word about Clara's performance had spread faster than anyone could imagine. People who hadn't even attended the event before now arrived early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who made a broken piano sing. By the time Clara arrived, the hall was packed. Children sat cross-legged near the front. Older folks leaned on their canes with expectant smiles, and young people whispered excitedly among themselves. The once quiet town now hummed with new energy, an energy born from awe and admiration. But Clara, as usual, came simply dressed. The same soft cardigan, the same shy smile. She hadn't expected this. She had only come because Tom, the host, had begged her gently that morning. "People want to thank you, Clara," he'd said. "You've given this town something it hasn't felt in years. Hope." She had blushed, unsure how to respond. She didn't see herself as a hero or a miracle. She still saw herself as the same ordinary woman who poured coffee at the diner and walked home with groceries in a paper bag. Yet now, as she entered the hall, the crowd rose to their feet. For a second, Clara froze by the door, startled. Then a wave of applause erupted, louder, fuller, more heartfelt than before. It rolled through the hall like thunder mixed with laughter and tears. Some people cheered, some whistled, and others simply clapped silently, their eyes wet. Clara's heart raced. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Never in her life had she felt such warmth directed at her. Tom stepped forward on the stage, his smile wide. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice full of pride, "last night something magical happened in this very hall. A moment none of us will forget. Tonight we welcome back the woman who reminded us that beauty can come from the most unexpected places." The applause swelled again, and Tom motioned toward Clara. "Please, Miss Clara, join us." The crowd cheered louder. Someone shouted, "We love you, Clara," and laughter rippled warmly through the audience. Clara walked slowly toward the stage, her eyes glistening. She didn't know where to look. The faces smiling at her, the hands clapping, the lights that felt suddenly too bright. It was overwhelming, but also beautiful. When she reached the piano, she placed her hand gently on it as if greeting an old friend. The hall quieted instantly. Every eye was on her. She took a deep breath. "I don't have words for what I feel," she began softly, her voice trembling. "Last night, I only wanted to play a few notes, to make you smile. I never imagined this." The audience listened in silence. "This piano," she said, glancing down at it lovingly, "is old and broken, just like I once felt. But sometimes, even broken things can still make music, if someone just gives them a chance." A hush fell over the hall. Her words sank deep into every heart. Then she smiled shyly and added, "I don't know if I can play like yesterday, but I'll try." The audience didn't move or whisper. They simply waited. Clara sat down once more, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the familiar keys. The piano, still worn and imperfect, gleamed softly under the lights. She looked at it for a moment, and then she began to play. This time the music was different. It was lighter, freer, like laughter mixed with tears. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was gratitude. The melody danced through the hall, filling every corner with warmth. The broken keys hummed along, their imperfections now part of the charm. People swayed gently in their seats. A few closed their eyes, letting the notes wash over them like waves. Even outside the hall, people who couldn't fit in stood near the doors, listening quietly. The music built slowly, rising and falling like a heartbeat. It carried a message without words, that life, no matter how painful, could still be beautiful. When the final note echoed into silence, Clara lifted her hands and looked up. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air was thick with emotion, soft, fragile, sacred. Then, like a spark igniting a fire, someone stood up. A single clap, then another. And suddenly the whole room was on its feet. The sound was thunderous, a standing ovation that shook the wooden floor beneath her feet. People cheered, some cried openly, and others simply pressed their hands together in silent reverence. Tom, standing beside the stage, had tears running down his cheeks. He raised his hand to quiet the crowd for a moment and said, his voice thick with emotion, "Clara, you've reminded us what it means to feel. You've reminded us that even the simplest person can hold the greatest light." Clara covered her mouth, overcome. She shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "I only played," she whispered. Tom smiled softly. "You did more than play. You healed something in all of us." The crowd clapped again, louder, stronger. Someone handed her a bouquet of daisies, her favorite flower, and she accepted it with trembling hands. As she stood there, surrounded by applause and love, Clara felt a warmth she hadn't known since her childhood recitals. Only this time, it was purer. It wasn't about fame or perfection. It was about connection. For years she had believed her music was gone forever, buried under the weight of loss and time. But that night, standing on that humble stage, she realized the truth. Music never really leaves the heart that loves it. It waits, patiently, for the courage to return. And as the ovation continued, Clara smiled through her tears. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, loved, and alive. Weeks passed, Yet the memory of that night refused to fade. The sound of Clara's music still lingered in the hearts of everyone who had heard it, soft, haunting, and unforgettable. The town that had once been sleepy and ordinary now carried a quiet spark of inspiration. People still talked about the night the broken piano came alive. Everywhere Clara went, smiles followed her. Children waved at her as she walked to work. Old folks stopped her on the street to tell her how much her music had moved them. Even strangers from nearby towns began visiting the diner just to meet her. But Clara never let it change who she was. She still wore her same cozy sweaters, still greeted every customer with a warm, "Good morning," and still took her evening walks under the same soft sky. Yet inside her, something had changed forever. A piece of her soul that had once been silent, now sang quietly every day. The piano in the town hall became something of a legend. People started calling it Clara's piano. The mayor had it repaired and polished, but Clara insisted they keep one of its broken keys untouched. "Leave it as it is," she said with a gentle smile.
That note is part of the story. The townspeople agreed. That one broken note became a symbol, a reminder that even in imperfection, there can be beauty, truth, and music. One evening, the local school invited Clara to speak to the children.
She hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't something she enjoyed, but eventually she agreed. The small auditorium was full of eager young faces, each holding notebooks and pencils. She stood before them, her hands trembling slightly. Then she smiled and said, "When I was your age, I loved music more than anything in the world, but life took me away from it for a long time. I thought I'd never play again. But sometimes, life brings you back to what you were meant to do, even when you least expect it." A little girl raised her hand. "Miss Clara," she asked softly, "weren't you scared when they laughed at you?" Clara nodded. "Yes, I was, very scared. But do you know what helped me?" The children leaned in. "I remembered something my father used to say," she continued, her voice tender. "Don't play to impress people, play because your heart has something to say. When you do things with love, fear disappears." The room was silent for a moment, then the children began to clap, small hands applauding a big truth. After that day, Clara began teaching piano lessons every weekend in the community hall, the same hall where her story had been born. At first, only a few children came, but soon the number grew. Parents brought their kids not just to learn music, but to learn courage, the kind Clara had shown. Every week, laughter and melody filled the old hall. Sometimes Clara would sit beside the students and play a duet, her eyes shining with pride. The townspeople often stopped outside just to listen. Her music had become part of the town's rhythm, a heartbeat everyone could feel. Months turned into years. The story of the simple woman and the broken piano spread far beyond the little town. Newspapers, blogs, and even a few TV shows mentioned her story, not as a tale of fame, but as one of faith, humility, and rediscovery. Clara never sought attention. She never gave long interviews or posed for photos. When people asked why she didn't chase the spotlight again, she simply smiled and said, "I've already had my stage. Now, I just want to share the music." And she did, quietly, beautifully, every single day. One spring evening several years later, the town held its annual talent night again. The same event where it had all begun. This time, the hall was newly painted, the lights brighter, the air filled with laughter. The piano, still lovingly called Clara's piano, stood proudly at the center of the stage. Clara, now older, sat in the front row surrounded by her students. Her hair had turned silver, but her eyes sparkled just as they always had. When the host announced the next performer, a little girl named Amelia, one of Clara's first students, the crowd cheered. Amelia climbed onto the stage, nervous but smiling. Before she began, she looked at Clara and said softly into the microphone, "This song is for the woman who taught me that broken things can still make beautiful sounds." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Then Amelia began to play. The melody was simple, tender, and filled with emotion, a small reflection of the same magic Clara had once brought to life. And when it ended, the crowd rose again in applause, not just for Amelia, but for the legacy that Clara had unknowingly created. As the ovation filled the room, Clara looked down at her hands, older now but still strong, and smiled. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't just a prank after all. It was destiny." Outside, the evening breeze carried faint echoes of piano notes through the open windows. The stars above seemed to shimmer in rhythm, as if they too were listening. And in that quiet little town, the story of the woman who once played a broken piano lived on, not in fame or fortune, but in hearts, in memories, and in every child who dared to believe that even the simplest soul can create the most extraordinary music. Clara's name became more than just a memory. It became a melody, one that would never fade.